Thank you. I'm Jim Ellis, Assistant Managing Editor at Business Week, and thanks for being here. One of the things that I like to tell my kids is America is a place where equality is an important sort of precept of how we got started in our world today. And so it made me think a little when planning today's conversation. Almost 250 years ago, Thomas Jefferson sat down and wrote the Declaration of Independence, at least the first draft. And in it, he said some words that we all learned in school, but I think can sort of inform our discussion today. And since I can't remember those, because I'm not young anymore, it said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among those, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Now, I think we all know that that sounds great on paper, but it's very, very difficult to live a life like that. And even in Jefferson's time, well, they wanted all these rights for everyone, but actually not women. And actually it was all for men, but actually not all men, not black men. But then it actually wasn't for all white men because not people who didn't own their own land. And all of a sudden you start seeing that the premise of equality is a lot trickier than what we sort of like to think. And so what's happened is over the years, lots of people have had to use activism and use grassroots organizing to find ways to make America the country that it's supposed to be and to actually live that American dream. I'm really happy today that I've got two of those people with us. And I think that you all have read the bios, but I think there's a couple of things to remember. That Alicia Garza is no newcomer to talking about this. She's, as you know, worked with the Domestic Workers Alliance, giving voice to people who are often thought of as workers at the low end of the scale and people would often ignore. And also, I think that her internet posts that coined those phrases that now we take for granted, Black Lives Matters. I mean, it seems like such an obvious thing, but it's sparked a national conversation, and I think that that's one of the things we're going to talk about today is how do you do that, and what does that mean in getting, you're making equality really work. The same thing with Cristina Jimenez, who through United We Dream has sort of taken something that a lot of us sort of overlook, the fact that millions of people in the U.S. are undocumented, and the children of undocumented families that came here through no sort of fault or volition of their own, or we've made promises to these people that they have to be, they can be here and be part of the American dream, but somehow that's become a political football that's not working anymore. And she's no newcomer to this. When you were at Queens College, you were an activist. When you were in the City College, you were so the thing is that there's something about activism and grassroots organizing that just doesn't start yesterday. There's a history there, people who do it, sort of work at it, and I'm glad we've got two of the best. Now, one of the things that I've always wondered about when we talk about the American dream is it difficult for our children to really understand when you talk about, the American dream for Black Americans right now? Is that something that you truthfully can say, yeah, it's going to work out in the end?
Well, I sure hope so, or else I'm putting in a lot of work for not much output. But I think, the American dream is something that should be available to everyone. And I think we all believe that to some degree. And I think you're right in your description of how the American dream that was supposed to be for everyone gets kind of parceled out to only some people. And with us and our work at the Black Futures Lab, we really operate under the premise that Black people deserve the things that all people deserve. And that includes liberty, justice, equality, dignity, respect, safety, wellness, and all the things that it takes for us to live well. And it's the same for Black Lives Matter, although we've expanded that, right, to be able to talk about all Black people, not just Black people who are born in this country, but Black people who have migrated from other countries to the United States to be able to access those things that all people deserve.
And Cristina, is it difficult to talk to young people who might be undocumented about what America stands for? Do they sort of view it now as, well, they're trying to change the rules on us?
Well, there are many of the reasons for why people like my own parents made the difficult decision to come to this country back in 1998 is because there's a true belief on the values of this country: dignity, opportunity, freedom. And for someone like my dad, for example, who grew up homeless in Ecuador, the notion that he could make the effort and the sacrifice to leave everything behind to come here and ensure that his kids could go to school, work, have a life of dignity, and not have to have his experience is the drive that many immigrant families have for why they come here. Now, very quickly, you learn that that's not necessarily the case, and that because of your skin color, your immigration status, you're fearing deportation, you can't pursue higher education and achieve many of the dreams that families come seeking. And so when we're working with young immigrants in United We Dream, they truly believe in the aspirational values of this country, which is why, even though we are now recognized by this country as undocumented people, we truly believe that we ought to do the work to get the country there. Not just for us, because we are constantly living with the fear of being deported, or that our family members could be deported, and particularly in this moment in our country. But because we want it for everybody. So I think that the promise and the aspirational vision that we can get the country there is one of the reasons why young people are very inspired to do this work, and to organize and to courageously share their stories.
Alicia, is it, when we think of people who are activists, I don't know if, every generation has its activists, but is there an age skew to that? Or does there need to be an age skew to that?
Well, let's break that down a little bit.
Okay.
Because to be an activist or to be an organizer means that you are someone who is taking responsibility for what happens in the present and what happens for our future. And so in that way, there should be activists and organizers of all ages. And I know Cristina and I wouldn't be here if we weren't mentored by people who have been activists and organizers. And then I know that we also take on the role and the responsibility and the joy, I think, of cultivating new leadership so that it's not just about Cristina or I, but that it's about millions of leaders that can build the kind of movement in this country that ultimately can transform power. That's what we're building towards. So we often say that, these movements that we talk about now as Black Lives Matter or United We Dream or the fight for immigration reform, the fight for citizenship and humanity, they're old movements. We're just carrying forward, right? The best of what we can take and trying to innovate so that at some point we can be making new mistakes and fighting for new goals beyond just humanity, right? That's where we're at now. It seems like the low-hanging fruit. We really want to be able to build a society where at one point we can say, back in the day, folks who didn't have citizenship, right, weren't allowed to vote, were scared in their communities. Back in the day, Black people were being killed with impunity by the very people who were sworn to protect and serve you. And today, we have new problems because we built a movement, we connected across sectors, across issues, and we fought for what all people deserve.
Yeah.
Movement, I'm always intrigued by this notion of, how do you take movement and move it into organization? Now, Cristina, I know that, United We Dream now has, 400,000 members. It has, active in 26 states. I mean, that has sort of made this transition over. Was that a difficult transition?
Well, I think what's important, as Alicia was mentioning, is that there's a recognition that we do not live single-issue lives. And many of the challenges that we are facing are coming from, systematic challenges and racism that we all are fighting to change. And when young people understand that when they come into a space like United We Dream, an organization where they can feel safe and can be empowered to do their work, It was actually a very strategic choice, knowing that an organization, it's not a movement, right? A movement is a very vibrant ecosystem network of people, of artists, of activists and organizers, institutions, and organizations like United We Dream, and we're part of that ecosystem that can be used as a tool to develop leaders and to leverage specific moments. For example, with the termination of the DACA program, which protects people like my own brother from deportation back in September. And because we were able to build a national network with over 400,000 members now, we were able to really rise to the occasion and be there for our communities in that moment. Not only by organizing rallies and marches, but actually empowering people with the tools to protect people from deportations and raids that are increasing in our communities. So I think very early on in the genesis of our movement, which is all generated in the early 2000s, there was a very strategic choice to ensure that we had a home where we can ensure that people could feel safe, because being undocumented and living with that fear all the time, you're feeling not safe 24/7. So we needed a space where people could have community, and from there also be empowered to take action. And to use our power of collective action to generate change. And I think that winning DACA in 2012 was that taste of power, that after almost a decade of organizing, we were able to have an unprecedented policy change, probably the most positive on immigration for the last 25 years. And that really was a catalyst for us to make strategic choices about strengthening our network.
I know a lot of people who are active in movements sometimes worry that the closer you get to politics and the more politics becomes.
We were just talking about
that. That all of a sudden it can sort of change that. So Alicia, I mean, I know that I've seen interviews in the past where you have questioned, don't let it get too political. Tell me a bit about that thought.
Well, let's be clear. The political system in this country is incredibly damaged. And that shouldn't be a controversial statement. I mean, when we turn on the news every day, we see how fragmented, how fractured, and how cynical people are about politics. And there's good reason for that. And I think that we have to be careful when talking about kind of what is the future of politics, to be really clear that what we're actually going toward is power. And the way that we understand politics is that it is a snapshot of who's in power and who's not at any given moment. And so the reason to engage in politics, right, is for the purpose of power. But power is not politics, okay? So with that being said, we have created new institutions and organizations that are really geared towards looking at the ways in which Black communities specifically are really caught in the crosshairs of this dynamic of politics and power. And there's ways in which in our communities, having a seat at the table is considered power. But the way that we understand power is the ability to make decisions over your own life, the ability to determine where resources go, the ability to shape the narrative of who we are and who we can be, and the ability to levy rewards and consequences upon those who are elected to represent you based on whether or not they do that alongside the agenda that you believe in.
Okay, let me ask you a question on that point. Now, I know that one thing that political parties traditionally had been able to do was to sort of mass a large number of people in an organization. You can reach them, but the internet has changed so much, and I want to ask you about that simply because I know that it's a way to often reach people who don't fall into the typical political box. And it's one of the things when Black Lives Matter first came on the scene, I thought it was, I don't want to call it an internet phenomenon, but it was one of those things that was so enhanced by the ability to be transmitted directly to people. Is that the promise of the internet when it comes to activism?
As long as it stays open and free, yes. Okay. But we know that that's a big challenge. I think what the internet allows us to do as it relates to politics is to quickly connect and engage and to mobilize and to educate. So you have access to way more information at your fingertips than we ever have. And that's important when thinking about how to engage in a political system. However, I'm somebody who thinks and who is observing that parties, as they are constructed right now, are really declining. And so there's a big question for us right now about where the future of parties will go. What is the future of the Republican Party? What's the future of the Democratic Party? And then are those the structures that are actually needed right now to advance a new framework for what we want to see in this country? And the answer to that question is up to us. So when we built the Black Futures Lab, we built it to build independent, progressive political power for Black people in cities and states. That's our goal. And we're now also having to figure out how are we relating to the Democratic Party or not, and how are we or not relating to the Republican Party. But bigger than that, how are we relating to the question of building political power so that we can make decisions over our own lives?
Now, Cristina, a lot of, so many undocumented residents don't have that political power in the traditional sense because they don't have the ballot. How do you work around that?
Well, in the context of power, I think that there's a lot of sources of power. One could be the power to vote. Another one is the power to change narrative, to create new narratives, to disrupt the status quo. And we do that through direct action. We do that through the organizing work that we do. And what I have witnessed and been part of with the immigrant youth movement that I've been part of for the last 13 years is that even without the right to vote and being able to flex that source of power, electoral power, young people were able to disrupt and change the way in which we were talking about immigrants and immigration. And the way that you will see people like me and my parents and question whether I belong here or not, or whether I deserve to be treated with respect or not. And we were able to change that. So, and at the same time, those stories and the narrative has been a huge tool for us to motivate voters to come out. And we've done this in places like in Houston, Texas. Quick story here. People did not think that we could win the termination of a contract between ICE and local police that was, really increasing deportations, probably the highest number of deportations that we were seeing in Houston. And we decided to organize, to share stories, to organize with allies, Black communities, LGBT communities, reproductive justice groups, and all together run a campaign where undocumented youth were showing up at the doors of voters and saying, this is my story. This is why I need you to come out to vote for the sheriff election, because the sheriff has the power to either continue this collaboration that is deporting my family and could deport me next, or have a different sheriff in town. And we were able to terminate this contract and to have a different sheriff in office.
Hey.
And so, that's just an example of how we can think about our power in different ways.
Now, Alicia, is there competition there's so many things that need to be made right in the world. Is there competition between these sort of movements in the sense of grabbing public's attention and sort of time and interest? Is that still a challenge?
Well, I would hope that we would recognize that we're not going to get free without each other. And so part of the kind of foundation of Black Lives Matter, part of the foundation of United We Dream and the Black Futures Lab is really based on understanding just that we are intertwined and interconnected, and that's the kind of world that we want to build. And so if we want to achieve the changes that we want to see, it means that we have to see each other as each other's responsibility. We've also tried to change the narrative by complicating who Black people are so that we don't have this two-dimensional version of what Blackness is. Black people are migrants. Black people live in rural areas. Black people are lesbian and gay and bisexual and transgendered. Black people are a number of different identities and experiences. And so it's really in our own self-interest to align those various components of our communities. And similarly, it's in our interests as a movement to build a movement of movements that can transform power in this country.
Well, all this conversation about change, it makes me think of one other thing from the Declaration of Independence. We all hear about the first part, but one of the other parts that Jefferson wrote was that when our government doesn't operate the way it's supposed to, we have a responsibility to alter it. And I think that that's one of the things that both of you are doing, and I want to congratulate you for that. I also want to thank you very much, Alicia Garza, Cristina Jimenez. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.